right, welcome to Technology Business Research. We traditionally do event perspectives after we attend analyst events or conferences, but what we thought we'd do this time, something different. We all went to see PwC in New York City in November, and so you're going to hear our conversation as though we were kind of taking the train back and looking at our notes and comparing and talking, discussing what we learned at the event, what we thought about it. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to walk through every part of the event with you two, with Kelly Lesiczka and Boz Hristov, analysts on the professional services, IT services, and digital transformation team. And we're going to talk about what we saw at the event, what we think about PwC. So the morning started with a bunch of presentations from PwC leadership, including JC LaPierre, Mohammed Kandi, Jenny Kohler, and Harry Kumar, and of course, Joe Atkinson, the CTO. Kelly, is there anything that sort of stuck out for you out of all those presentations? Or were there any themes that you heard throughout?
Yeah, so it was very interesting to hear the center around trust, focusing on the sustained outcomes, the focus on trust with clients and building that trust for clients, and kind of just thinking about the way that PwC follows through in the say-do ratio, in a sense of we're actually doing what we're saying that we're going to do, and we're actually achieving those outcomes. And that kind of flowed through into the client presentations as well.
Who was it that kept saying the say-do ratio? Was that Jeannie or was it JC LaPierre?
I think it was JC.
JC, yeah, that definitely, we heard that throughout the course of the whole day, which was fantastic. Boz, how about you from the opening sessions?
Yeah, I think that sustained outcome certainly is a good way to ground what PwC is about and where PwC is heading to, I guess. Think about, we've been following PwC for several years, and we're trying to think about what's next for PwC. And when they bring up sustained outcomes, to me, that speaks that PwC will not just be with the client in the beginning from the business transformation discussion, consulting opportunities, but also throughout the customers executing throughout their roadmap and just trying to think about what's next and trying to make sure they can execute on those outcomes and they can ensure that those outcomes are being achieved, which is very much thinking about, PwC has been talking about strategy through execution, but at this stage of the game, pretty much everyone does speak the similar language. And for me, the sustained outcomes is taking it a step further and thinking about using the knowledge, using the insights from the managed services engagements that they may be getting, involved in, and how much that they can feed into the front end of business consulting, trying to better understand what's the collaboration level across all the parties throughout all the steps as customers execute on their business transformation, digital transformation programs. So I think it's a little bit of play of words, sustainability. It's a good way to think about in the new way of like how customers are thinking about, okay, how do we actually address also our decarbonization needs and ESG requirements and so on and so forth, which also plays in favor of PwC with their ESG portfolio offerings that they can actually help them to measure and track around ESG, but also sustain outcomes is really about how can they achieve those goals and then even and more, from business transformation frameworks, technology, the business blocks that Jotkin's talked about, thinking about not just getting into what's available today, but really how we can get into the technologies of tomorrow, and trying to be constantly engaging, trying to constantly challenge each other internally from a resource perspective and the training that they apply, but also challenge the customers and work and connovate with the customers. So in a way, I think PwC is setting itself you're setting the bar pretty high for themselves. I gotta say that, because when you're reaching for those sustained outcomes and trying to achieve those KPIs, you also you'll be able to manage the quality along the way, because they're known for quality. They have the trust on the front end, but now you're talking about throughout all the phases of a customer transformation road mapping. So it's a higher table stakes, new opportunities in the managed services, new opportunities in the building blocks of the next generation of technologies, and really bringing up the ecosystem together, both internally as well as externally with their technology partners.
Yeah, I think, and to build on both of what you said, three things that really stood out for me. One, and Kelly, you talked about this a little bit, the say-do ratio, but really it's about how everyone talks about solving a business problem, PwC is sort of taking it to the next level and saying, not only are we going to help you solve the business problem, we're going to stick around and make sure that that's sustained business outcome. So that's part of it. I think that message, and I know they did this intentionally, resonated through the rest of the day, because all of the clients that spoke throughout the rest of the day came back to this idea of sustained business outcomes. So they sort of set it up really well. And then Boz, you mentioned what Joe Atkinson was saying, and he did talk about a focus on building blocks of technology, not just the current applications, which was his sort of forward-looking part. But I think he also grounded it by saying, I wrote this down as, quote, "We didn't arrive yesterday to start thinking about technology." And I think that's an important part too.
Yeah.
And some of us have been looking at PwC since 2007. So it goes back a little ways. So that was the first part of the morning. The rest of the morning was about client stories and hearing client presentations. And the way they structured was great, because they did the client presentations and then they allowed for breakout sessions where you were allowed to ask more questions. So we heard from a large soft drink retailer. We heard from a hospital, a research hospital in particular. And we heard from an energy company, a global energy company. So out of those three, Boz, why don't you go first this time? Which one, or what stood out for you, either about the client's relationship with PwC or what PwC was delivering to the client?
Yeah, maybe
or something else.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I'm thinking about the large beverage retailer. I mean, I think it was a great story that, in a way, was encapsulating what PwC is all about and how PwC is evolving its value proposition, and again, reaching and delivering those sustained outcomes on multiple areas. Every problem starts with a business discussion. There's a business challenge that PwC is well known for, and they can execute on that part. But it has quickly evolved into, let's think about the ecosystem, thinking about what are some of the solutions that we can work together, and bringing in solution partners and technology partners like Salesforce and Microsoft along the way that can actually help and build together, and kind of which fits essentially into the PwC's not industry clouds, the segment clouds, the sector clouds value proposition, which is very much in line that CPG kind of like, okay, let's try to bring in not just what we know from a CPG from a business standpoint, but also let's try to rely on our technology partners, their knowledge, and some of the processes that need to be applicable to a CPG retailer. So that evolution of the value proposition was really key to hear how they able to stitch together the partner angle. But on the flip side is also how PwC did not just rely on its laurels in sense of like, oh, we have the relationship, we can do more, we've done more with this client, but constantly went ahead and challenged the client, thinking about outside the box, trying to bring in the design thinking and the agile methodologies, and trying to be a little bit more proactive at what's expected. The further more interesting side was the client talking about how they didn't just give the job to PwC. They actually challenged them back essentially and put up the additional work and the next phases of the transformation work for bids, which is a great way for clients to keep the incumbents on their toes, because often incumbents, they do have, the lag against, some of their competitors in terms of like they have the relationship, they've proven their value and so on and so forth. But from a client's perspective, putting a new work out for bid is a great way to get even more out of someone like PwC, because then they can really challenge themselves. And it sounded like PwC would manage to do that because they won the new work. They expanded the wallet share from that client. Again, bringing the business, bringing the technology knowledge from their partner ecosystem, and trying to really go into that step further and how they all work together. So I think it was a great client story of like where PwC was, how it evolved, and where it's heading, essentially.
And I think that part came out about them having to rebid and them having to work for that next engagement. Came out during the breakout sessions. We even had a conversation separately on the margins just to confirm that was really the case. That's what he was really saying. And to me, that's about as good a kind of a endorsement of PwC as it gets, because we all know in the consulting business, the relationship is so important. So if a company of the size of this particular client is able to say, look, the relationship is important, but you still need to prove it every single time, that's pretty good for PwC. Kelly, what did you see or hear that you thought was different?
Yeah, so I really enjoyed the healthcare client story. It's interesting how different things that are specific to the industry or the client's physical environment really do make a difference, and kind of taking that into consideration. It was also interesting the way that the client had spoken a bit about teaming and the importance of really bringing everyone together, as it's more difficult to convince certain roles, such as the clinicians, just different parts of the organization. It's harder to convince them to embrace these new technologies and really change their ways of working. If it's not broken, don't fix it. So just kind of working with PwC to really encourage that change and enable them to use the new technologies that will help them and then help their business work better, helping their patient care improve, and just kind of looking at that. And it also goes back to that fit for purpose strategy that PwC is really looking to go, and kind of changing themselves to work towards that end goal and to the purposes of the organizations.
And the teaming was something that Mohammed Kandi in particular brought up during his session in the morning, was the emphasis on teaming. So then the hospital client just reinforced that. My favorite was, this is no surprise, was of course the energy company, because it's where I always end up. But the two things that jumped out at me, one of the things that the client talked about was PwC's ability to provide them with what he called anchored agility. So PwC helped them with the culture, helped them with the change management, helped them understand the big picture of where they were going, and sort of gave them the foundation, but at the same time was able to be agile. It was a huge SAP transformation that they were undergoing. So being able to still be agile with something as cumbersome as SAP can be. No offense to SAP. And then the other thing that he mentioned, and this was, I think, really important because, again, it was a global US-based global energy company, was working with PwC globally, was, I think he used the words transparent. They were aware and transparent, meaning they were aware of all of this oil companies' challenges globally and individually in each of their regions. But PwC was very transparent in how they worked across their member firms and how they brought their talent to the table globally. So I think when we think about PwC, that's always one of the challenges, is how do you operate as a collection of member firms. According to this client, it was pretty seamless and transparent. So that was the morning. So the afternoon at the PwC Global Analyst Summit in November, New York City, which was fun. It was fun to be in person again. I honestly was sitting here thinking this morning, I can't remember a single thing about lunch, which means we must have had good conversations all throughout lunch, because it was just good to be, again, in person with everybody. The afternoon also included client sessions. There was one quick presentation on ESG, which our colleague John Kroll will address in his decarbonization market landscape. But the three clients were, again, another healthcare client, this time a university health system, then one of the largest telecom companies, networking companies in the world. And then the final client story was actually, well, I'll say it because it was Microsoft. It was a partner as much as a client. So Kelly, you first this time. Which one of those three, or was there a theme across all three that you caught?
There was a theme, but also the networking communications company, the presenter on that end, he had said there's no such thing as zero trust. It really should be maximum trust. And that was something that you don't necessarily think of, but it does make a difference. Like zero trust, you're kind of losing the meaning behind it. And you do need that maximum trust, especially with something like communications, to get through and really make sure everything's authentic. And just the way that he discussed how they were changing or transforming, it was just the way that everything was sourced and how you authenticate things. You really do need that maximum trust. But again, it goes back to that whole underpinning theme across the whole presentation around the outcomes and the trust. But also just thinking about how you do need to go beyond the strategy and looking at those different elements, such as the security approach and how you're actually supporting that and how you execute around that afterwards.
Yeah, he was good. He also talked about the better user experience equals better security, which I thought was a really smart way of thinking about it, because we all know it's true in IT, it's true in technology. The technology is never the problem; the humans are the problem, and that's got to be like the number one lesson out of security, is that you can have the best security, but if the humans mess it up.
Which I think reminds me of the morning session with a large beverage retailer, where PwC actually, as part of the work groups, they were getting the end user basically as part of the discussion and trying to think about what are the implications to someone who's the end consumer, who's the end user, and then how they actually provide that feedback, and which is, I think, it's a critical element of the feedback loop as they think about sustained outcomes, including the end user, not just what the customer tell them, but what's the customer's customer going to, how they're going to be using it, and how. So, which is security is even greater important as well. Yeah.
And I think typically in the security space, you just think these are the requirements we need to meet. These are the challenges, these are the requirements, these are the restrictions. It's put that way, not what's the user experience going to be, and the better the user experience, the more likely it's going to be a more secure environment. So it was a really good session.
Outlooks, he went through a lot of things that happened over the past year, and I think one of the main things that stuck out to me was around the theme of risk and how you really need to be mindful of de-risking a lot of things that you're doing, just with the different changing outcome or the changing conditions around the country or around the world even. And coming off of that, he was mentioning how the country of the United States is becoming more and more divided. And I think it's something that PwC did address, and you can kind of see it through their client interactions as well, as how we really do need to come together in some sense and bringing together the clients with that whole sense of teaming, and just kind of changing the culture that you're working in, changing the way you work with others through either communications or just different solutions. So it's very interesting to hear how the world conditions or the country conditions, it really does impact the way that PwC is changing its approach to working with clients in the areas that it's focusing on to help them better embrace technology or embrace different ways of working. So that struck out to me quite a bit.
Yeah. And the two things that jumped out at me, he mentioned the way that PwC is able to help clients, in particular and this gets back to the sustained business outcomes, in the way that they're trying to reach those outcomes, understanding and knowing that they're going to get results, but not trying to move so quickly because you need to get them right away, but understanding that you can, in his words of going slow to go fast, especially around cloud, especially around migration to the cloud, that if everybody during the pandemic all of a sudden wanted to go to the cloud, well, those rapid migrations didn't necessarily bring the kinds of benefits that people expected, and as a result, you sort of get a little bit burned. And then PwC is basically saying, hey, if you can take it more methodically, slower. That really resonated with a couple of the clients that I was standing with that were listening to it as well. And then the other thing he talked about was that the clients are now focused on portfolio simplification, like just trying to do what they do really well. And that is sort of one of PwC's core pieces of advice right now, is pick the 2 or 3 things that you do well and do those well. And for me, that really resonates because it's what we've seen over the years, looking at IT services vendors and consultancies in particular, and within this broad space of digital transformation, everyone who is able to focus on those 2 or 3 things that they do well and sort of stay within their lanes and be excellent in their lanes tend to be the best partners, tend to be the ones that have the most success, tend to be the ones that are stickiest with their clients because their clients really depend on them for what they do really well, as opposed to those vendors that try and do too many things or try and be all things for all people. So that was one of the big things I took away from his speech. So now let's take a giant step back. It's been since 2019 that we were in person with PwC, and we've all been looking at this firm for a while now. A lot has changed. It is not your father's PwC, as we have famously said, and we're not sure necessarily where it's going to be in a year. But what are the things when you think about, and Boz, I'll go to you first. When you think about PwC now, PwC in 3 to 5 years, what do you, and if it requires going back and saying, well, here's how much they've changed, where do you think it's going to be heading in the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I'm thinking about who PwC as a firm is today and how it has changed, first of all, before we can probably look into the future. To me, PwC has become, and I brought up, I think in one of our teaser interviews last week, about how much more balanced they are, which kind of falls into their new equation, and thinking about not just one side of the equation, the business side, but also the technology side. I mean, obviously, the strategy discussions provide kind of proof of the value of a particular transformation, but the technology starts to provide proof of viability of that strategy, right? And thinking about where it is. And PwC is certainly has started adding those business blocks. I mean, not just on advisory, but the tax side, and try to thinking about the implementation side and so on and so forth. So building those kind of like that equation in parallel, I think it's has helped to bring PwC where they're a little more balanced in the approach. With that said, moving forward, maintaining that balance will certainly present a challenge, but also an opportunity, because depending on how well and how much they're thinking about the partner ecosystem will be key as to maintain that balance. To your last point a moment ago about staying with your own swim lane, trying to pick 2-3 technologies, try to pick up 2-3 areas that you're really good at and go deep rather than going too wide. That's going to be a key component moving forward as they're trying to balance that equation as they have reached that inflection point as of today. So it's going to be about talent, technology, and really innovation as they're thinking about making that balance approach. There's a lot of noise in the market from both competitors and the macro perspective that certainly will present its challenges along the way. As long as PwC and PwC leadership manages to kind of filter that noise and stay focused on what they really are good at and what they really care about, and incorporate their lessons learned from the last 3-5 years to apply forward and make those incremental adjustments, not big disruptive changes. Those big disruptive changes, it's a double-edged sword, but I think they're going to be in good shape. Who they are, I think they have the strong value proposition from being a big 4 firm, which soon might be a big 3 firm, or kind of a consortium. So, there's a lot of value there. And as long as they manage to continue to bring that forward as part of discussions with their clients, and they include their partners, and from a technology perspective, going to cloud, going to AI, going to data, going to other technologies, blockchain, and so on and so forth. We talked about, those building blocks, I think, as a more on the peripheral rather than trying to be, the go-to and becoming the next cloud provider. Right. I think they're going to be in good shape.
Excellent. That's enormously positive.
Yes.
Kelly, I'm not going to look for you to the negative, but where do you see? Same kind of question.
Well, I think it's kind of necessary to see how much the consulting space has evolved as well. One of the presenters had mentioned how the previous view of consulting had been our mess for less, and I feel like it's kind of moved moved far away from that. It's not quite that same model. Even one of the clients had mentioned how the whole project was more in real time. It wasn't necessarily, we'll go through like the strategy or look through PPT. It was more looking at what's happening in real time, how to fix what's going on. And I think that's kind of how PwC will follow. They've kind of evolved alongside their clients. We've already talked about the say-do ratio, but I think it's also more of that responsibility and accountability on the PwC side. So doing what they're actually going to say to, looking at the ESG, for example, looking through some of those metrics, actually reaching some of those green goals or the energy goals. So actually moving alongside with their clients and kind of following similar trajectory paths. Because as consulting has changed, it's the integration of more of the technology side or the software side. It's all coming together. It's not all segmented anymore. It's not just one group. There are a lot of it. So kind of managing all of those different groups, I think, will be something that they'll have to follow. And good or bad, I don't know, but definitely something to keep in mind as they go through.
So right after the conference, I went to Germany and went with some of PwC's leadership. And everything you just said, they said in a way of challenging our TBR's understanding of the management consulting world. And they essentially said, hey, TBR, management consulting has changed. And you need to look at us and look at the consulting world in a different way. And I think you're exactly right on that. And that's probably where they're in very good shape because of, Boz, what you mentioned, they can learn from their changes they've made. They haven't made drastic, radical, massive changes in the last few years, but they've made some really important ones, particularly around PwC products, around the way that they've structured. And we've seen that they've been fast learners when they've needed to make changes, when they needed to make pivots, they have. So when I look at PwC and I think about what we do all the time, which is what's their strategy, what's their performance, do the two things go together? Looking ahead 5 years, I think what would a successful strategy be for PwC? Do they have that in place right now? I think the new equation is a big part of it. And Boz, to your point, that equation is a balance, and they got to make sure they get that right. The technology is key. The talent is key there. But I think, Kelly, what you're saying is critically important as part of their strategies, recognizing that consulting as a business has changed, and PwC can continue to change with consulting with their clients. And then that gets us all the way back to the beginning, what's in this notebook of sustained outcomes. And we're right back to that point again. Yeah. So thank you too. Any last comments on PwC before we wrap up? No, it was a good trip. It was a good conference.
Yeah, definitely enjoyed the trip. Enjoyed, seeing people in person. That was a great experience, Having the networking, opportunities were really good, and just looking forward for the next one.
It was fun. It was nice to see some people I'd never actually met in person before, so that was very cool. Yeah. So excellent. Well, so that's our event perspective on PwC Global Analyst Summit in November of 2022. And if you have questions for us, please reach out. Thanks.
Thank you.